So, I was going over my channel a bit and realized that I kinda had a glaring gap in my coverage. In all honesty, it was probably because I don't really play these kinds of games that often. I just never had any real interest in them, and that's, well, sports games. Most of us know series like the 2K series and the Madden series that were, or are, hugely popular and in many ways started to really push the gaming medium more into the mainstream. The question today, though, is how did these kinds of games get their start? What came before 2Ks and Maddens? How did the franchises really come about anyway? Well, rather than try to push you towards a dozen or so other videos with various different bits of this particular story, I thought I'd try to cover it more concisely today if I can. So if you have a minute, sit back and hang out a while as we go into the history of the humble sports game. Now, the very earliest sports game I could find is one that a lot of people call the very first video game ever, and that's Tennis for Two. This game was made on a Donner Model 30 analog computer. You heard me, analog. They essentially built the game to display on an oscilloscope, which, for those of you who don't know what that is, was basically a device made to graphically display varying voltages showing amplitude, frequency, etc., which is all well beyond the scope of this video, but it's important to know that something used to tell variances in voltage was used to display a video game. That just goes to show you everybody really wanted to play video games even on oscilloscopes. The game itself was actually pretty simple, and basically it was a straight line along the bottom that would represent the court. There was a small line in the center that would represent the net, and the ball was just a small wave dot moving back and forth. Players would use the button on the aluminum controls in order to serve and hit the ball, and use the knob to control the angle of the shot itself. And that's pretty much it. That's your first basic tennis game, all the way back in 1958. This would be followed up later by Bear's Brown Box, which would eventually be marketed as the Magnavox Odyssey, giving us tennis. Now, this was a simple affair of moving two blocks back and forth and hitting a ball that you could use to control the arc of the tennis, like Tennis for Two. One would move it so you could hit it, and the other one laid to arc the ball. Right? Pretty simple. However, unlike Tennis for Two, there really wasn't a court represented unless you used an overlay film that would go on top of your TV screen, which would help you better visualize your court. In fact, most sports games would look similar to this or Pong in many ways, using just a few different names like hockey and, of course, tennis. In the arcade, you had games like Grand Prix, which was one of the earlier racing games that came out in 1969, and games like Heavyweight Champ, which was a primitive boxing game. That one dropped in 1976. And this evolution would continue to take on a much wider dimension on the Atari. And that's really not saying much by modern standards. Sure, the games looked more like actual games, but you had the most basic of sprites. Some just looking like blocks, or all just looking like the same guy. Even the names were just basic things like baseball, tennis, boxing, etc. However, for the time, it was great and innovative in its own right. Eventually, Mattel would drop their Intellivision console, which would officially license things like NBA basketball and MLB baseball. Did this change much? Not really, but it let the consumer know that these were officially sanctioned games approved by these organizations, legitimizing, in a lot of ways, the sports genre. It wouldn't be until around 1987 that sports games as we know them today would really start to formulate with Earl Weaver Baseball. This had some of the most realistic gameplay to date used in a video game, influenced heavily by Earl Weaver himself. Now players had a real taste of what video game baseball could be, and they wanted more. EA was happy to deliver with games like Madden, which, while most of us know it from the 16-bit era, actually showed up first on the Apple II computer, getting the PC market more involved in something more than just racing simulators that had been doing for, well, quite some time. Then in 1989, Sega would shake things up again in an effort to shake Nintendo's stranglehold on the console market. They intended to change the age group that got into video games by pushing more of an adult console. How do you do that, you ask? Well, first off, you make a mascot to rival Mario. Check, there's Sonic. Then you start investing heavily in sports games. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Sega Sports. This is where sports games really took off into what we know and love today. Games like NBA 95, 96, etc. would come out with named rosters and stats for each player. Madden got bigger than ever. In fact, Sega Sports was so big that by the time the Dreamcast came around, it was Sega Sports Games which would eventually become 2K Sports, and EA as the main driving companies behind these games. The graphics got better, the roster is more detailed, it seems everyone wanted the latest versions of their sports franchise each year. So much so, other parts of the industry would stand up and take notice, starting to do yearly iterations of their other games, like Call of Duty. However, what do you guys think of this evolution in sports game history? Do you have a favorite era? Do you have a favorite title? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, if you don't mind, give this video a like, and if you haven't, consider following the channel. That helps me out a ton. Until we meet it again though, have a great rest of your day, and happy gaming!